The biggest reason, in my opinion, is that punishments had to be cheap and quick, and corporal punishment was an easy way to have a punishment that was cheap and quick, and had a fairly big impact. This country at the time was not advanced in terms of its tax system, and it wasn't wealthy enough to be able to pay for more expensive punishments that came later, like transportation and prisons. So there were few alternatives. There had to be a punishment according to what society thought at the time, and it had to be cheap and quick. So corporal punishment was the most logical step on that rung. I would bob some examples in here. I'll leave that till the next paragraph though, just to explain them. My second reason was that the Normans were a bit different because they'd invaded and conquered the country, and they needed to keep control of a country that was full of people that didn't necessarily want to be ruled by the Normans. And one way that they could keep control of the country was through fear, which we know that the Normans did. They did a lot of things which made people fearful of them, so they behaved. And one way you could create fear was through corporal punishment, by making punishments so unpleasant that they were a deterrent and made other potential criminals look at the punishments and go, won't fancy that. Now, for this whole question, you'd need to be dropping in some examples, and it's really hard because there's not so many to talk about. One you could talk about was the forest laws, though. So William introduced the forest laws, and the forest land was the king's land. People weren't allowed to chop down trees there or hunt there. If they were caught, they had 2 fingers chopped off, which would be the fingers that they would use to pull a bow and arrow. If they were caught again, they would be executed, but the fingers chopping off thing was a deterrent, which would stop people wanting to go on that land. And then the other examples, well, they would still do whipping. I guess it was up to the individual lord in a certain area to decide on a punishment. They certainly used the stocks, and that although humiliating, was also very uncomfortable and would hurt after being stuck there for a long time. So you could class that as a form of corporal punishment, but you'd have to explain it, as I just have there. So yeah, it'd be difficult to give specific examples because a lot of punishment was up to the individual lord or the sheriff who was in charge of that area. But they'd certainly use whipping, they certainly chopped fingers off in the forest laws, and if you explain it properly, the stocks, if you were kept there for long enough, would hurt and would ache. So you could class that as corporal punishment, but only if you explained it. But generally speaking, it's a tough question because there's not that many specific knowledge examples to use to back up what you're saying. But for me, main reason, punishments had to be cheap and quick. Second reason, the Normans had to try and keep control of the country some way, somehow. For this type of question, you need to know the various different possible justifications or reasons for punishments. And retribution, like it says there, is a bit like getting revenge. It's like if you say, oh right, they've been sent to prison for 20 years, and you go, well, they deserve it. That's retribution. That mindset of they deserve that for what they did, that's retribution. And I don't think it really was the main reason for the punishments of that time. But there are examples where it certainly plays a factor, and obviously it plays a factor through all of them. But the ones that it really has a potential big role in is things like hung, drawn and quartered. And that was a horrible way to die, and it was probably invented because to show people that treason was completely unacceptable and this is what you deserve. They whipped vagabonds, and they did it in public. And it was to teach them to stop being vagabonds and to stop them interfering in that area, sort of get their own back. You shouldn't be here, you shouldn't be doing what you're doing. And just, I said vagabonds and whipping. Corporal punishment generally could just be a case of get your own back, and they deserve this. And of course, another one that less often looked at is fines. Often the fine would be more expensive the worse the thing the person has done. So that suggests retribution, as in like, right, you've done this crime that's this bad, so you have to pay this much money. But, like I said, I don't think retribution was the key reason for punishments at this time. In my opinion, the main aim of punishments was a deterrent, but this is because they had to have something which stopped crime in the absence of a developed law enforcement. And there was no police force, and explains why many punishments happened in public. If it was for retribution, it wouldn't matter whether the punishment was in private or in public. But they did punishments right out in front of the crowd, so they saw what was happening, so that everybody who saw these punishments thought, I won't fancy that. And so it was a deterrent to try to stop further crimes from happening. And we've talked about hung, drawn and quartered, sticking people in the stocks, whipping vagabonds happen in public as well, burning people for not recanting, Mary the First, that happened out in public. Most punishments, or a lot of punishments, happened where everybody could see it, so that it put people off from doing it. And there we go, make sure you put that logic in. It can't be, if it was for retribution, it didn't have to be in public, but it was in public, so people saw, and if they saw it, it would put them off or deter them from wanting to commit crimes themselves. A final possible reason I'd write about is to remove the criminal from society. And I would be making myself appear clever and understanding the period here by saying, well, removing the criminal was the most important aim of punishments, but not till the very end of the period when transportation began in the 1660s. So that's only in the last 40 years of the 200 years in the question, and they would get criminals and take them somewhere else to remove them from society. And in the last 22 years, from 1688, the Bloody Code had appeared, where 50 crimes were then punishable by death. Again, it was removing the criminal from society. So by 1700, removal from society was the most important, could have been the most important point, but it can't have been for the whole 200 years. And that's why deterrent, for me, would be the most important reason. And even these punishments of transportation and the Bloody Code themselves, they were horrible punishments that were a deterrent themselves. And I just think, and maybe arguably until the Victorian era, but probably until the 20th century, i.e. the 1900s, the main reason for punishment from the start of our course till at least the Victorian era, and you could argue the separate system, was deterrent more than anything else. And because again there wasn't a developed police force. As soon as a police force comes in the 1800s, 19th century, you could stop having punishments that were specifically for a deterrent. That's just a side point for any question about punishment that I thought I'd make, just for make a note of for your exams. Now, this is very similar to a question from the first part of these on crime and punishment. And again, we have to write about religion because it's mentioned specifically in the question. Religion was important, and it's difficult to get your head around this. But at the time, the Reformation had happened, which meant, that's when Henry VIII had split from, the English Reformation was when Henry VIII had split from the Pope and created two churches in England, the Catholics and the Protestants. And people were really scared whether they were going to heaven or hell. It increased fear, increased people's willingness to believe in superstitious things. And religion made more people willing to believe in things like witches at the time, because there was it was at the forefront of their minds all the time, about hell and heaven and the devil, and worshipping in the right way. So all of this time, the Reformation was a time of religious uncertainty and fear, and all of that makes people more willing to believe in things like witches. And the Reformation was important, but I wouldn't say it was as important as government/monarchies, or monarchs. And there's some big examples for that, because of course 1542 there was a Witchcraft Act brought in which made witchcraft punishable by death. And if the person in charge of the country, the king at the time, Henry VIII, makes a law like that, then it makes people think, well, if the king believes that it's happening and it's serious, we should all believe it too, because people thought kings were put on the planet, on the throne by God. So they think kings are powerful. They've got the divine right to rule, and God is working through them. They believe that time because they're so religious. and the monarchs making these sorts of things. And James I, he wrote a book, Demonology, in which he said that his wife and his family had almost been drowned at sea because some witches cursed them. And there was also the Civil War, which was between the king and the government. And that was going to increase fear and superstition because so many people died. And it was not a coincidence that the Witchfinder General was doing his business during the Civil War, when there was even more fear and want to blame people for the terrible things that were happening than normal. And the Civil War could be laid at the feet of the monarchy and the government because it was the king fighting the parliament. So there we go. And I would have that as my main reason. That the people ruling the country were the main reason why there was an increase in witch hunts. Finally, people write about the Witchfinder General. So he's the most famous example of witch hunts. But as I said in the last part, I think last part of this set of podcasts, the first part, I don't think Matthew Hopkins was a reason so much as a symptom of witch hunts, of what was going on at the time. If people didn't already believe in the whole witch thing and were worried about witches, then nobody would have listened to Matthew Hopkins when he came saying he could solve the problem of witches in East Anglia. So he didn't so much cause what was going on as he was a result of everybody's already existing fears, which was largely because of religion and the views of the government. But he did increase the number of witch hunts because he was the one doing them, but only really in East Anglia rather than the whole rest of the country. And he probably inspired others, but like I say, I would be using that little phrase at the bottom. Matthew Hopkins, although he did increase the number of witch hunts that took place, was really more of a symptom rather than a cause, because if people didn't already believe in witches and weren't already worried about them, then Matthew Hopkins wouldn't have been able to have had the success that he did. My first reason and main reason of why vagabonds were treated like criminals is because they actually were criminals. By definition, if something is against the law and you do it, then you are a criminal. And so I would back this up, and this is a good way to get some knowledge in there. 1531, the first law, specifically mentioning vagabonds, said unemployed men or women found begging or vagabonds were to be whipped until their bodies, quote, be bloody, and then return to their previous residence or birthplace. So that they were criminals. So you must treat them like criminals if they are criminals, and that's kind of like, you can't argue with that. But there were further laws that came after that, with punishments including slavery, mutilation, exile and execution. If the government creates a law which says being a vagabond is against the law, then you do that, you are a criminal by definition, and therefore that is the main reason vagabonds were treated like criminals. And that sort of answer, I think, would smash it out the park when the examiner reads it, because barely anybody else would be writing that sort of thing. Hopefully you would. So get revising your vagabond laws. Second reason I'd give is because of poverty in society. It was no coincidence that more vagabonds were arrested when there was a bad harvest than at other times, because that's when the places that the vagabonds were going to would have been poorer and more annoyed about the fact that people were turning up and asking for jobs and begging. And also it would turn more people into vagabonds because they were struggling to get by where they lived, so they'd go off in a search to try to find some other work somewhere else perhaps. And so there's a specific example there that in 1600 there were 555 vagabonds in London, which was a time when there were bad harvests, but 40 years earlier there were only 69 recorded in London. So poverty caused vagabonds because it meant people were struggling to get by, so they moved to try to find a better life. And when the vagabonds turned up in a place, it increased the intolerance people had towards vagabonds because they themselves were struggling to get by. And it all, I guess, links to the fact that people up until this point didn't move out of their area very much. and so they were suspicious of outsiders turning up, but that suspicion and intolerance would increase when they themselves were struggling to get by. So yeah, poverty would be a reason why vagabonds were treated like criminals. Lovely question this, well set out in the textbook, well set out in revision guides. But it's one for 2 paragraphs because it just seems to fit, because it's decrease and increase. So you do one on a decrease, one on an increase. And highway robbery increased because, well, my main reason, horses and guns became cheaper. And you needed a horse and a gun to be able to be a highwayman. Before this, guns and horses were so expensive that somebody who could afford them wouldn't have been a highway robber because they would have been wealthy enough. And well, I guess it was mostly because of the Civil War that left England with a lot of guns and horses. And also, after the time where highway robbery increased after the Civil War in the late 1600s and into the 1700s, more and more travellers were on the roads as roads increased. There wasn't any law enforcement between settlements, or not much anyway, so it was easier for robbers to commit crime in between towns. And there were a lot of unemployed ex-soldiers who knew how to ride horses well and knew how to use guns. And like I said, that's one reason why there were a lot of guns around and guns became cheaper, because the Civil War had ended. So these unemployed ex-soldiers needed something to do, and many of them were hardened killers from the war. So they turned to highway robbery. And you have to have 2 main reasons in a question like this, because there's kind of 2 questions. My main reason it decreased is because the banking system became more sophisticated, so people didn't have to take their money with them when they travelled somewhere else, because there might be a branch of the bank in the other city that they could draw their money out from. So there was no point trying to rob people travelling from one place to another if they don't have anything with them. So for that reason, the banking system improving is my main reason why there was less highwaymen. But there was also mounted patrols. The Fielding brothers, famous for being the Bow Street Runners, they organised a mounted patrol outside London and dramatically reduced the number of highwaymen operating there. The land that the highway robbers were using on the outskirts of cities, well, Britain was expanding in the 1700s, Industrial Revolution, so that land was built on. Stagecoaches, so lots of people, lots of coaches together, meant a lot more safety, and the highwaymen often sold the stuff that they'd nicked in taverns along roads, but the justices of the peace in control of those taverns, if they found a tavern was allowing highwaymen to sell their stuff, would refuse them a licence, so they couldn't be a tavern anymore. So taverns stopped allowing highwaymen in there to sell the stuff that they'd nicked. For all these reasons, highwaymen robbery decreased. This first and my main reason is not made a big thing of in the textbook, but hopefully you'll see my reasoning why. Transporting people from one place to another costs a lot of money. It costs a lot of money now. If you wanted to fly to Australia or America, it would cost you a lot of money, and that's now, when it's easier to do. So think of how much it would cost to send somebody to the other side of the world. A huge amount of money. We wouldn't have been doing that unless there was a big advantage to being able to do it for the government. And that was because the government wanted control of America and Australia and other countries like that, because of the amount of resources, the size of those places, and the potential wealth you could get out of them. So I would argue that the main reason we used transportation as a punishment, although it had other advantages, was because the British government wanted to have British people living in these places so that it would claim that land for Britain more easily. And if there wasn't such a big advantage, we wouldn't be transporting people because it costs so much to do. And my second reason why transportation became so popular was towards the late 1700s and into the 1800s, so the 18th and 19th centuries, more criminals were getting away with whatever crime they'd committed because of the bloody code. Juries were looking at a case and going, well, he's only nicked a loaf of bread, or he's only committed a minor crime, and if I say he's guilty, he's going to get executed, and I don't want that on my conscience. So juries were often saying people were not guilty when they clearly were, because they thought the punishment of death was too harsh. And transportation was an alternative punishment which would stop juries from thinking, oh, I can't have him executed, but we'll have him punished by being sent away. So transportation became a more popular form of punishment for that reason, because of the problems with the bloody code being seen as too harsh, and therefore criminals getting away with the crimes. So there we go, that's my second one. I only do two in this question, as you see. For this sort of question, you're going to get a bit of bonus here. You can have this again, hopefully will make you stand out in an exam. Attitudes in society was the most important reason for punishments, but only from the 1800s, in fact specifically from 1832 onwards. What you've got to remember is, punishments were controlled largely by the government. They set what punishments should be. And up until 1832, the government didn't have to pay much attention to what attitudes in society were. They could choose to do what they thought, because there wasn't really much of a democracy. But after 1832 and the Great Reform Act, which meant lots more people could vote than ever before, suddenly the government had to pay attention to attitudes in society, or they wouldn't get the votes they needed to be in power. But in the full 500 years of this question, this is only the last 170 years where there's been a development of a democracy. So up until that point, they didn't really have to listen. After 1832, they really did. But all of this explains the changes to transportation during the end of bloody code. So attitudes in society meant that people didn't want to convict criminals because they were going to be executed. So transportation became more popular. And it also explains how separate system and silent systems, the prison system in the mid to late 1800s, had to be pretty harsh because people wanted them to be harsh, especially the silent system, because there was an outcry about the garroting crisis, about the garroting gang that was going around strangling people in London. So the people of England were going, right, this system needs to be harsher, we need to deal with what's going on. And people in the late 19th century thought criminals were born as criminals, so there was no point in trying to rehabilitate them or reform them. All of this attitudes in society. Attitudes in society also explains why the death penalty ended in 1965, the Derek Bentley case, and how he had a mental capacity of a young child and was still executed. All of this swell of opinion against the death penalty caused the death penalty to be abolished, and also explains how conscientious objectors were treated, because people in the First World War thought they should be treated harshly, and they were, and the attitudes towards conscientious objectors had relaxed a little bit by the Second World War, so although they were punished, they weren't punished as harshly. So there's lots of examples where attitudes in society changes how punishments were enacted, but specifically after 1832, when the government really had to be receptive to what attitudes in society were so that they could win votes. And if that the 1832 Great Reform Act is not in the textbook anywhere, you knowing that attitudes in society were important after 1832 is going to massively make you stand out, and be very important for a question like this. So hopefully that's useful for you. But attitudes in society weren't the main reason, as from what I've said, only in the last 170 years it was. Across the whole period there was one thing that was really important, and that was money. There is a very clear pattern, and I'll be saying this in my exam, a very clear pattern that punishment started off cheap in 1500 and got more and more expensive as time wore on, because the country got wealthier and therefore it could afford to do punishments which might be more fit for purpose. So for example, the prison system couldn't have come in until the 1800s because we didn't have an effective enough tax system and a wealthy enough country to afford to pay for it up until that point. But you can think of like punishment, execution and mutilation at the start, and then you get the bringing in of transportation, which is more expensive in the 1600s. Transportation increases in popularity until it dies out in the 1850s. Prisons come in, you get young people prisons, you get different types of prisons in the 20th century, in the 1900s, until the prison system that we've got now, which is, it costs something like 30,000, and it costs approximately £30,000 a year to keep a prisoner in prison now, which is ludicrously expensive. But yeah, so for the reason that pattern is quite clear, the reason that punishments changed more than anything else, the biggest influence on punishments, was the availability of money, the ability for the country to be able to afford to pay for certain punishments. Well, this is pretty much a carbon copy of what I've just said, only that was in 500 years and this is 200 years. Again, attitudes in society. This time, attitudes in society, again, it's only the last 70 years of this, but I say people got the vote more and more from the Great Reform Act. Government had to change punishments to be in line with attitudes. The bloody code, to transportation, to prisons, this was all because of attitudes in society. Juries weren't convicting. Transportation had become not so much of a punishment anymore. People wanted prisons to be harsh. The prisons had to change themselves because of attitudes. We've talked about the garrotters, and we've talked about attitude, and this bit I didn't talk about. Towards the end of the 19th century, people believed in criminals being born the way they were, and that idea is social Darwinism. Social Darwinism became popular in society, and therefore prisons changed. And of course, now the end of the death penalty didn't happen until 1965, but the end of public executions happened earlier than that, as you can see on the screen, and so you could talk about that. But as with the last question, I would say money would be the main reason, because we could afford to pay for more effective punishments. So we developed a prison system after the 1823 Gauls Act. The government built prisons after their first one in 1842, Pentonville. The deterrent of the bloody code was no longer necessary and so crucial. Like having punishments as a deterrent was not so important after 1829 because a police force existed, and that was again because we could afford to pay for a police force. So yeah, again, money for me is the main reason why punishments developed over time. Now again, if you've got time, you could do a third paragraph. I'd probably do two on that one, but if I did have time to come back and add one, I'd probably talk about the role of the reformers. So John Howard, he wrote a report that raised awareness of the problems with prisons and how ridiculous it was in the old system, and Fry did the same, but she also managed to get other Quakers to join in to help out in prisons. And of course Robert Peel, as Home Secretary, he was influenced by Howard and Fry. He was motivated to try to make the country a better place and a fairer place, and as Home Secretary he introduced the Gauls Act. So you could include a paragraph on how they changed punishments, specifically prisons, in the 1800s, but you know, it's just a bonus one that you could pop on there.